Hello. I want to discuss the latest dispute involving the gender pay gap, alleged gender pay gap. Now, I'm saying alleged because I believe that where this is brought up, it does apply in certain cases. It does apply in specific industries. But I do have a problem with the sweeping statement there is a gender pay gap. I think that's alarmist and misleading because it sends out the message that men in general are paid more than women, which is simply not true. However, there are certain industries where there is a discrepancy and it needs to be discussed. So, this latest report involves the BBC China editor Carrie Gracie. Now, interestingly enough, I'm actually quoting from the BBC's own report, which is always interesting when they're kind of reporting about themselves. Um, and it's by no means a biased article. They're not really defending themselves. They're basically just laying out the report. So basically, Carrie Gracie is the China editor. The BBC has four main international editors for China, the United States, the Middle East, and I believe the other one is Europe. Not 100% sure about that. But because this had become a prominent issue last year, the BBC was forced to reveal the salary of its highest earners, i.e., those gaining over £150,000, which is what the Prime Minister earns. And apparently, she wasn't on that list, meaning that her salary is less than that. Now, Carrie Gracie, I'm somewhat familiar with. I've seen some of her reports. I think she's a very fine journalist, and I do think that her brief is a challenging one. It is challenging for any journalist to work from a country that is not known for being very friendly to the media, or at least outside media. China has an appalling track record of media freedom, one of the worst in the world. And it is not easy for any Western reporter, any outside reporter for that matter, to report within an authoritarian country. Not necessarily physically dangerous, but certainly journalists do risk harassment, and a lot of barriers are put up in their way, which incidentally, I would just say this very briefly, when Chinese nationals complain about biased Western media, they need to remember that it's the Chinese government that makes it difficult for outside journalists to do the job properly. But under these circumstances, I believe that Carrie Gracie is a very decent journalist. She speaks fluent Mandarin. She's always respectful to the host nation. Um, I regard her as a very professional journalist. So this caught my attention. And apparently, like I say, she wasn't on this list. So that means she earns less than £150,000. Now, to be fair to her, she said she wrote an open letter on this. The Equality Act 2010 states that men and women doing equal work must receive equal pay. But last July, I learned that in the previous financial year, the two men earned at least 50% more than the two women. There's two male editors, two female editors on the international among international correspondents. Despite the BBC's public insistence that my appointment demonstrated its commitment to gender equality, and despite my own insistence that equality was a condition of taking up the post, my managers had yet again judged that women's work was worth much less than men's. Miss Gracie said she asked for the four international editors to be paid equally. Instead, the BBC offered me a big pay rise, which remained far short of equality, she added. I believe I am very well paid already, especially as someone working for a publicly funded organisation. But that bit's significant to me, and I'll explain why in a second. I simply want the BBC to abide by the law and value men and women equally. She said patience and goodwill are running out among female staff. Now, many people will love the BBC being their Fred face or something like this because the BBC has long virtue signalled on issues like feminism, right? And they've long, in a sense, preached about things like this. In the BBC Director General, Lord Hall, pledged to close the gap by 2020, saying the corporation should be an exemplar of what can be achieved when it comes to pay, fairness, gender, and representation. Now, um, just to quote the figures for two other editors, apparently John Sopel, who's the US editor, earns between 200,000 and 249,000, 999. and the Middle East editor Jeremy Bowen earned 150 to 199,000. Jeremy Bowen also, I think it's fair to say, has a pretty challenging brief. Um, okay, so this is my take. I am pleased that she was quick to stress that she felt she already earned enough. So she is making the point that it is about equality, not about the amount. And I'm pleased that she did say that, because one issue I take with the whole debate around the gender pay gap is it is almost entirely women in higher paid professions who are complaining about this. Um, and I do think that they need to be careful not to give the impression that they're complaining about the salary. I mean, I have to say, I have very little sympathy for an A-list Hollywood actress complaining that she's not getting as much as an A-list Hollywood actor. Um, I understand the principle of equality here, but I do think if you are on six figures or seven figures, you need to be very careful how that is perceived by the public if you're basically complaining about pay. Even if your issue is there's a discrepancy, you need to really stress that it's about the discrepancy and not the pay itself. And I think that's something that's been missing from this. But there's also a lack of consistency in this debate. If we are talking about men and women being paid the same amount for doing the same work, let's look at other industries. Let's look at education. Now, last year there was a huge controversy over Dame Professor Glynis Breakwell. She's the Vice Chancellor of Bath University, and that caused an outcry when it was revealed she was receiving an enormous salary, 468,000 plus thousands more in bonuses, which is far more than the Prime Minister. She was the Vice Chancellor of the UK's smallest university, or one of the smallest universities, the University of Bath. And eventually the controversy meant she had to step down. Now, if we're taking this argument about equal pay to its full, then under that logic, then all the male vice chancellors will be earning the same as her. So there is a lack of consistency in this argument. Why is it always about women earning this? Because actually, there are some industries where you could argue women are earning more. I would argue that education seems to be one of them. Um, but like I say, I think it is noticeable that this tends to be in professions that are known for being well paid, media, acting, and so on. You never hear of lower paid women, or at least that is far less of a focus. Women in lower paid professions complaining about not being paid the same as men in lower paid professions. Why? Because in Britain it is illegal to discriminate on the basis of sex. Therefore, in the vast majority of professions, men and women actually are paid the same. And that's something that irritates me about this whole debate. I think there is a good deal of scaremongering. So I appreciate um, Carrie, Carrie Gracie looking at this and saying, well, I do the same job, I should be paid the same. I can see her perspective there. And I think she's a good journalist. But again, I think that this is something that is really, really being put into hyperbole, in the sense that the way the feminist movement talks about it and the way campaigners talk about this, they say, oh, we're campaigning that women get paid the same as men for equal work. What they don't say is that actually, in the vast majority of professions, that is exactly the case. And I suspect there are many, many other factors at play. Now, in this particular example, I think that Carrie Gracie probably has a point. She is essentially doing the same job as the other international editors. She should be paid the same. Um, In fact, it could be argued her job is more difficult than, with all due respect to Mr. Sopel, his job, because he's corresponding from an English speaking country. So you could argue she has a more difficult brief. But I do think that there is a lot of scaremongering over this, and I find that deeply irresponsible when it is reported. Um, so, this idea, when I hear people say men and women are not paid the same, it's simply not true. It is simply not true, because the vast majority of professions actually they are paid the same. And I think there are other factors that are not being discussed by campaigners. For example, in certain indices where there may be an overall situation where it appears that men are being paid more pro rata, it could be because of issues that are not entirely being discussed. Um, for example, if you get a situation, a job that involves physical strength, common sense dictates that the average man is physically stronger than the average woman. Let's say, for the sake of argument, in a factory, and I have to be careful how I say this because I might be accused of sexism, but I'll say it anyway. Let's say your job is getting paid for how many boxes you shift, right? The fact of the matter is the average man is physically stronger. So if you have 100 boxes to shift, man and a woman, the chances are the man is going to shift more boxes in the same amount of time than the woman. Okay, that's not sexism. It's just a fact. The average man is physically stronger than the average woman. They're doing the same job, but if the worker is then being paid on how many boxes they shift, the man will probably get more because he has shifted more boxes. It's a crude example, but I think there's things like that that are not necessarily being discussed. Anyway, I'll leave it there. I'm not pretending that I know all the issues here. I think that Carrie Gracie probably has a point. Um, and I do respect her for being quick to emphasize that she felt she's paid enough. That's very important because I have very little time, for example, for A-list Hollywood actresses whinging about their salary. I mean, if you are getting, I don't know, 2 million for a film, and your male colleague gets 3 million, okay, it's not technically fair in that context, but you're still being paid far more than the average person will ever see. So I do think anybody who is paid well needs to appreciate it in itself, in itself, particularly when so many people are struggling. Now, don't get me wrong, frontline journalists, in my opinion, do deserve a high salary. They take real risks and they do an essential job. So I do think they deserve their salary. But I don't know. I think there's a lot of issues here that aren't always discussed, and it does irritate me, the hyperbole around it. So I would summarize by saying that there are some issues that need to be addressed, and I think this report would indicate that. But I do take issue with sweeping statements that really leave out some important information and present it as if men and women in general are not paid the same. I can honestly say I've done a wide range of jobs. I can honestly say there was always a standard payment for everyone. It was never a case I get more because I'm a man. No. So I think campaigners also need to be a bit more honest about this. And when they're expecting public support, they have a responsibility to show the whole picture, or at least not to scaremonger. And I think that's what a lot of this is about. Discrimination is illegal in this country. Now, if the BBC is breaking the law, that needs to change immediately. Um, so leave it there. Let me know your thoughts.